Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, heritage professionals, and others about history, games, and the places where they meet. I'm your host, Eduard Gafton, and in this episode, I am very much pleased to be joined by James Coltrain. James is an assistant professor of game art and 3D modeling for the University of Connecticut and also a historian of the Atlantic world and the early Americas, having written on colonial empires, architecture, material culture, labor, slavery, and religion. James's 3D modeling work focuses on advanced spatial visualizations, particularly visual reconstructions of historical architectural sites. James received a BA in history from the University of Kansas in 2002 and then received a PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2011. In 2015, he founded Historiated Games, a game studio dedicated to, and I'm quoting here, designing historically accurate, story-driven games that challenge and entertain, and dedicated to bringing past stories and spaces to life by transforming exhaustive archival research into richly realized digital experiences. Historiated Games' first game is Blackhaven, which was released for free on Steam in July 2021. Blackhaven is a first-person narrative game where players take the role of Kendra Turner, a sophomore at a historically black college, interning at the Blackhaven Hall Historical Society. This museum is the historic site of the ruined 18th century estate of Thomas Harwood, an American founding father. Working alone on a holiday, Kendra tends to the museum's exhibits, which sanitize the Harwood family and their slaveholding history, and is intrigued by gaps in archival documents she's tasked with scanning. Curious and resourceful, Kendra's digging leads her to uncover evidence suppressed by the Harwood family, with consequences that lead all the way to her present-day community. James, thank you so much for being on. How are you today?
I'm doing great, and thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here. I think you're the first person we have that is a video game designer first. We've mostly had so far board game designers and war game designers. I'm excited to finally tread familiar ground to me because I'm mostly familiar with video games rather than board games. Anyway, my first question is, how did Blackhaven start? What is the origin of Blackhaven?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit maybe later about how I got into video games, but Blackhaven specifically was I was doing some 3D reconstruction work for Colonial Williamsburg, which is a large living history museum in Virginia, the former colonial capital of Virginia. And while I was there for architectural reference, I would go to other museums, including the private homes of plantation estates that had formerly held, in some cases, between a few hundred and even all the way up to maybe 1,500 enslaved people in the colonial period. And they took a variety of approaches to the way that they portrayed their history and the way they portrayed slavery. But in more than a few cases, I'm sorry to report, they really obscured the role of slavery in the family history. I was in one plantation home where the docent was explaining how successful and entrepreneurially clever the family had been in accumulating their wealth without ever mentioning any of the free labor that went into that. And I went into another where, plantation weddings have been controversial in the United States in recent years, rightly so. And I had to walk around the tent that was being set up to have a wedding the next day. And that actually was the home of one master who actually is a historical inspiration for characters in Blackhaven. And so that just kind of unnerving feeling that I got as a historian at being of these sites of memory that just were places of incredible human degradation and abuse for decades and decades, if not centuries, and not to see that represented just kind of really stuck with me. And I thought that the idea of kind of exploring and perhaps uncovering a larger conspiracy in that space would be a good pitch for a kind of narrative exploration or walking simulator game. And so off I went.
Yeah, so how do you then go from being a historian to your passion for video games? How does that go? How did you get into video games is the question now.
Yeah. I had kind of an unusual path, although I would guess anybody in my situation would. I was working as a traditional historian, but a big part of my research was writing about architecture and material culture. And I've always been kind of a hobbyist in visual arts. And so at a certain point, I had learned to become a pretty skilled 3D modeler and animator, and I would do architectural reconstructions to illustrate the arguments that I was making about space and scale and architecture. And I took my first professor job was at the University of Nebraska, and because of that skill set, I was placed in a digital humanities center. And I started becoming a better coder and things like that to sustain some of the teaching and stuff I wasn't quite familiar with. And at a certain point, I realized I kind of have the skill set where I could start experimenting in games now if I wanted. And I've played games ever since I was a kid, all the way back to Atari and even original Nintendo and all of that. And so I started experimenting with a couple of concepts, both of which we're going to talk about today, and got completely addicted and obsessed. Totally switched my research agenda. Did the circuit, spoke at IndieCade and GDC and different things. And then at a certain point, I was just like, this is all I want to do. I'm not abandoning being a historian, but all I want to do is make games. And so that led to me transitioning to my current role in the digital media and design department at UConn. And so I still kind of have a foot in both worlds, but I'm based out of digital media now, and I'm really, really happy about that.
Fantastic. Are your GDC talks public in any way? As always, for the podcast, we want to include as many resources as possible. Is it public?
Mine is not currently listed as public, although I've recently seen that people can request to have them listed as public, which I didn't know. So I'm gonna send them a note and see if I can get that up. But I believe it was called a historian's guide to designing your historical game. But it's possible that might be up at some point in the future.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think you're the right person as well for speaking about this, because for the podcast and for the lab in particular, we speak about historical representations, and we also speak about accuracy, which is interesting. So then to go into this question about accuracy in games and in video games in this case, how has archival research informed Blackhaven? What lies at the foundation of Blackhaven in terms of research, in terms of actual historical information?
Yeah, in terms of this particular title, I had an advantage because my specialty as a historian was colonial Americas. And so I had a very broad-based understanding of this, and slavery was always a big part of my teaching in that space. And also what I thought was among the most important things that I would do as a historian is teach people about the role of slavery in the Americas. In terms of specifics, again, I had been on site a lot for architectural and material references in Virginia. And then the other unique thing about Blackhaven is that at a certain point, you literally are in the archives looking at documents. And so all of those have very direct analogs. Sometimes it's in the form of inspiration, but other times it's literally the documents themselves. Like one really striking, just quirkily depressing document that is a sort of catechism that is meant to teach children a skewed history of the Civil War and of Blackhaven's role. And that was lifted almost verbatim from a real document that existed that was publicized by the Daughters of the Confederacy in the United States in the late 19th century to try to indoctrinate children in a historiography of the Civil War that did not include slavery at all. And so like the graphic design and layout of that is almost exactly the same. And I basically just changed some of the questions to fit with Blackhaven. But then there were other things that were more broadly represented. And in visual reference, the design of the house is sort of architecturally sound and based on other examples. And when you're in the gallery, all of the artifacts were directly referenced with a surviving historical piece. And so, yeah, there's a variety of different kinds of evidence. Some of it is really, really, really direct, and some of it is more inspirational, but everything kind of has a root source.
Because Blackhaven in itself is fictional. It's a fictional place, right?
Yes, yeah. And so are all of I think a couple of times we name check Washington and Jefferson, but everybody who's a significant character is fictional, but all of their experiences are composites from actual historical events.
So then would you describe Blackhaven as an educational game? I know you call it a walking simulator, which we can get to in a second, but how How does Blackhaven tread the line of being being a product for education purposes and also being something for fun, something that you can sell to gamers who might not be interested in historical truth and historical fact?
Yeah, I kind of shy away from the educational label. I think just because, unfortunately, we haven't had very many strong examples of humanities educational games. And I think a lot of that just has to do with the pipeline in which they're created. Educational games tend to center on really objective content like chemistry or math or
Mm-hmm.
spelling, something like that, because those are kind of universally graspable topics. But if you want to do something in history, you have to have content experts. And so for that reason, people kind of shy away from those projects. I like to say, my goal with all of my games is for them to fit in an existing mainstream game genre. And so it's still niche for Blackhaven because I'd say, the two most relevant ones are walking simulators and interactive fiction. But I would hope that anybody who enjoys those types of titles or mysteries would appreciate Blackhaven, even if they're not interested in the historical content. Another way to look at it is, we can look at what's done in film, and we can have Hollywood films that have had a lot of historical research done on them, and then we could have something that was more like a History Channel reenactment or a play at a museum or something like that. And so I'm hoping that this fits more into the Hollywood model, where certain films take the history seriously, and Blackhaven certainly does, but I hope that it can hang with other narrative 3D games.
And in this sense, how do you think Blackhaven compares to other adventure titles, interactive fictions, walking simulators? Some of my favorites are Stanley Parable, Gone Home, Everyone's Gone to the Rapture. How does Blackhaven compare to these mainstream titles, which have had massive success in the respective genres or subgenres?
Yeah, I mean, I think Gone Home is probably more than any game, the game that motivated me to become a historical game designer, both because it's just such a wonderful narrative, but also because um, it's an example of a game that's told by looking at traces of evidence from the past. So that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what historians do. Yeah, I've heard people describe Gone Home as a sort of museum. And so when I saw that format being even mildly successful, I just thought, like, that's a perfect fit for telling a lot of historical stories. I think one of the biggest differences that we have, and I've gotten a little bit of criticism from this from Steam
Mm-hmm.
reviewers, but I don't think there's any way around it, is the great thing about Gone Home is you're in total control. And so you can snoop wherever you want, but you're also free to miss things or skip
Mm-hmm.
over things. And because Blackhaven is dealing with such sensitive material, I never felt at liberty to let people skip things and get the wrong ideas. So, like, the cutscenes are unskippable. It's more linear, perhaps, than it might have been otherwise. Kendra editorializes a lot, which also some people have really enjoyed. But so I don't think we get the sense of freedom that some of these other walking simulators have, just because the material is so sensitive and important that I didn't want anybody to miss the point of sort of what the game is trying to say. But I can imagine other historical games that maybe have a little bit less intense stakes, where we could bring back some of that just freedom to explore as you like.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you how was Blackhaven received? We spoke about the Steam reviewers, and I've actually gone through the reviews, but so I know that side of it. How was it received in your circle of academics and at university, at your university, versus how was it received with the mainstream public? And what actually is the target audience? You said you're aiming for Hollywood movies, but you also have an audience surely from the university, right? So like, how have those audiences differed in their responses to the game?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed is that it's doing really well among people who enjoy narrative walking simulator games. But I think one of the things, and there are pros and cons, but I decided to make this available free because I wanted it to reach the largest possible audience. And I think that that has helped with the number of people who have played it. The downside is you're going to get a lot of people who don't like this
Mm-hmm.
genre of game at all. and then they could be very cranky. So I think like our Steam reviews, oddly, might be a little lower than a game that was not free, which seems kind of counterintuitive, just because a group of people maybe who don't care for this kind of genre are playing it. But I think in the long term, that's worth the risk if we catch a few of them. I have been pretty pleased so far with the response from colleagues. I don't think a ton of historians have played it yet, but the ones who have been very, very complimentary. And in terms of the academic game space, I think people are very excited about it. It also, this game was created completely by myself and my writing team, and that's it. We did not have a corporate partner. We did not have freelance contractors from industry or anything like that. And so I do think it's one of the few examples of a game that has come completely out of the academy. And so I think people are excited about that as a model that, maybe they may also be able to participate in game creation at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think like even for the lab, we looked at your game and we were like, wow, this is truly something that we would like to do as well. And what a remarkable achievement, as you say, for you to come out of academia with this project. I think to launch it on Steam and to have success with it, and I think that's remarkable. And as you say, like you've developed Blackhaven in partnership with historians and scholars, including faculty members and students from the university. How is it working together on this project? How was working together on this project with that many people? How did you find managing students and then faculty members and so on?
Yeah, we kept it pretty streamlined because the majority of the collaboration was around the character of Kendra. And the technical end was easy. That was just all me. I did all the
Hmm.
coding, all the art. I even wrote the very average music, which no one has complained about yet. So I take that as a massive win. But what we did is I worked first with faculty. So I had a couple of meetings with HBCU faculty at Xavier University in New Orleans, Dr. Sharon Roberts and Charlene Senegal-Decour, and we talked about the concept. And then once I had kind of a rough script, what we did is we got together a panel of students who are basically in Kendra's demographic. These are young Black women attending an HBCU, and took them through the entire path in a table read of the game that Kendra goes through, and showed them cold a lot of the sort of shocking and troubling things that Kendra finds, and just had them react and then talk about their reactions. And those went in some cases directly into the game. And so the reason that we came up with the character of Kendra was, again, we wanted to guide the players. We didn't want them to go through this museum that has a lot of kind of subtle indignities in it, and have that completely go over somebody's head and just have them say fun museum, finish
Hmm.
up. And so it made sense for the character that would be more powerful for her to be an outsider. So definitely for her to be Black, for her to be a woman, for her to be a student, and even an employee. There's a lot of levels of kind of systems that she's up against. And so that's a great pitch, but that's not my life experience. And so, and even my colleagues, who are my age. And so, we let the people who have had that exact experience react as Kendra did. And then those things made that into the game. And then the last part of it was casting another former Xavier student, Darby Farr, to be the lead vocal role as Kendra. And she was just absolutely fantastic. And that's one of the things players routinely remark on as one of the strengths of the game is her performance. And yeah, I mean, she brought her own interpretations to the line readings that our panel came up with, and gave them another degree of kind of authenticity.
Mm. Again, on this collaboration, my next question is like, have you had a moment where you were like, oh wow, this is kind of becoming not the game I want it to be again, because you're not part of this demographic, because it's informed by so many people? What was some like maybe lines that like students told you that you were like, I am not sure about this? When were you involved in terms of decision making of like, oh, actually this might probably not make it? What how were those lines?
Yeah, I think like one thing that was interesting is when the students had opposite opinions of each other. And so like I can remember one student saying, Kendra should say like something like beaucoup, because that's like slang that we use. And I said, is that slang that young people in the South use, or just young people from New Orleans? And two of the other women who were not from New Orleans were like, it's from New Orleans. and so and we had discussions about like what Kendra's hairstyle should be, all kinds of little things. And then, I can remember also one time like a catch, and I don't think that the initial line was a problem, but it was just misunderstood. It was ambiguous. Kendra goes to the former side of the library, which is the most burned out part of the building. And so I had a line in there where she said something like, oh man, this is the most boring part or something. And somebody said like, we can't have her saying that the library is the most boring part. And of course, I was talking about what was left of the architecture, but they were noticing, yeah, somebody could read this as saying like, she's not into books. And so they're just like little things like that. Like, again, like, I don't even know that that necessarily pertains to my experience, but it's just a line that was ambiguous. And so it was good to put it in front of people who might hear it a different way and get that corrected. And so, but yeah, overall, it was a really, really rewarding experience.
Have the same students and the same collaborators also playtested the game with you, or did you do the playtesting and the actual, like, everything that pertains to the technical bits yourself?
Yeah, a couple of them did. Not all of them were into games, which is kind of also another
Yeah.
nice thing, that they were able to have a real fresh view. And then I had a number of my students at UConn play this. And I taught last semester a class where it was called Historical Fiction in Games and Film. And we would watch a film and play a game that were in the same general historical period, and then compare them to primary sources from that period and talk about the portrayals. And so one week we did Blackhaven, and I got a number of reactions from that as well. I will say, it was tricky play testing during the pandemic, where you can't sort of have, a physical room where people can rotate in and out and get reactions and everything like that. So there definitely were, we probably had 50 or 60 people play this with the intent of trying to break it, and fixed all those issues. And then within the first like 6 hours on Steam, people had found things that no one had ever seen. And so that's, and a small team also, we couldn't pay for like a QA firm or anything like that. So it's an adventure, but overall, I think it's gone pretty well.
So you said again, like, you did everything that had to do with the technical bits, but you started as a 3D modelist, as a 3D environmentalist. And then I want to ask you, how do you think being in a 3D environment, how does it change how we interact with history, right? Like, why is it important for Blackhaven to be a video game in this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, even though I was talking about how the freedom was a little bit limited compared to something like Gone Home, I do think pace is something that a 3D game has that nothing else has. When you teach a film as a historian, you just find yourself constantly pausing, during like maybe there's a 30-second exterior shot of a town that they walk through, and you want to pause and be like, okay, here's what they did, here's what they did, here's what they did. And in a 3D game, you have the space to look at what you want to look at, linger on what you want to linger on. And I also think scale and perspective are a big part of this. Blackhaven's a relatively small environment, but when we're talking about the size of the house, you get actually a sense of how big that is, and how striking it is that one white family lives in this giant mansion, kind of just on the fringes of Western society at this time. And then how many people must have gone into the maintenance of such a large estate? And that's not even including the massive farms that would have surrounded the estate, which at one point we mentioned in the audio tour. And so yeah, and I also I'm not really sure what to file this under, maybe phenomenology or something like that. But my advisor, Tim Breen, used to always say, when I was writing about a church or a fort or something, he'd say, at some point you need to just go down there and walk it, even if they don't have any documents there at the site, because it's just going to trigger things in your mind. Something about the embodying the first person perspective makes us think about things that we wouldn't have previously thought about. And so I think video games can be really, really powerful in that regard.
And do you think that now with, post the pandemic, in what, or better yet, still in the pandemic, like digital experiences like Blackhaven can do this for us in a way that, because we can't travel right now, so
Yeah, I think that's a huge benefit. And I also think that just video games have a potential to present restored history in a way that a site is never going to be able to. I mean, first of all, just budget, but like, something that is true, like if you go to Monticello and look at Jefferson's estate, they've restored the house pretty well to the, period of his presidency or so. But if you were going to get a sense of what Monticello was really like, they would need to own hundreds and hundreds of acres in every direction outside of that, which is now private, so they're never going to be able to show the true scale of that estate, let alone what it might feel like to have to wake up in the row of slave cabins by the main house and walk 5 or 6 miles before you've even started your day to get to work. But we can show those sorts of things in video games. We can get at that scale. Another thing that's nice is a lot of times historic sites have to make a compromise between which era they're representing. And so sometimes they're kind of representing actually nothing from history because they have bits of all, the different eras that are being portrayed. And so in video games, we'd have the freedom to show all of those as faithfully as we could.
Interesting. Yeah. Now I want to ask you. We spoke a lot about, again, like representations and history. I want to ask you just a broad question, just to kind of open this up. Do you think games should be historically accurate, just in general? And I know the answer to this. I kind of just want to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine most of your guests have probably said like yes or no, or yes with the qualifier or something like that. So I'm gonna be in the same space. I can tell you that for my games, I kind of have a set of rules. And so one rule is that anything that can have a historical source in the game needs to have one. The second rule is that nothing that I know can't have happened in this period should be portrayed in the game. So it's kind of like an inverse accuracy. And then beyond that, it can be more speculative, but I would still like to sort of at least have a kind of plausible explanation for things. But I also think that like true accuracy in games is both impossible and even undesirable. And so, like, I mean, an example of a minor point of just, I guess it's not really historical accuracy because it's set in the present day. But, in the latter part of the game, when Kendra goes searching for a scandal, she finds a folder that sort of has all of the receipts in it, so to speak. And if this was a quote unquote accurate game, she would have read through 10 or 20,000 pages of documents for each thing that she found. And so that's not really compatible with gameplay. But I also think that different sorts of things are easier for accuracy than others. So I think architecture and material culture we can be very accurate with. I think like pure sort of narrative points or plot points we can be accurate with, geography, personalities. But when we get into things like language, like how can we possibly have an accurate, even in Elizabethan period, which is still English, if we honestly portrayed that, it would be so awkward and stilted. No one would be able to relate to that. And there's so many things that we just also have no clue about, mannerisms and postures and cadences and things like that. It's just basically impossible to portray. And so I do think that we always have to fudge a little bit to make something that anyone will ever play. But I do think within that, there are certain areas where we can definitely be a lot more accurate. And then the final thing is there's always going to be not necessarily like an inaccuracy, but a potential to kind of slightly corrupt our interpretation or put our finger on the scale just with artistic flourish. So
Hmm.
any game that has music is manipulating the emotions of the player in a way that's not historical. And I always used to joke that the difference between this and normal history is like, it wouldn't be fair for me to say, you can only read my journal article when you're listening to the saddest violin recording in the world so that you're appropriately moved while you're reading it. But we do that sort of thing in games all the time.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely with you. Related to this question, were there any aspects of the game that you changed or you left out because it didn't accurately portray the setting or like the historical period you were in? Has there ever been a conflict in between the gameplay itself and the message that you were trying to convey here?
I think the I did enough advanced research on this that most of that was, anything that I was kind of surprised by, I usually had nailed down before I actually went into making it. I can remember I did like a really, really early test for Cassius, which we'll talk about a little bit later, of the inside of the house. And I had nice, shiny, polished floors. And then I learned that no one in 18th century America had a varnished floor. Like that's it's just not that's not a thing, which visually looked weird to me, and I was surprised by it. But um, yeah, I mean, because I went in with the intention of trying to be as accurate as possible, I don't know that there are a lot of things that I really had to fudge on. But I did think a lot about in terms of like what Kendra is finding and what's being presented, just sort of how those things were selected. And even if you were being really, really historically accurate, if you're portraying a slaveholder, say the selection that you make, those people are humans with some positive qualities, and so you could find letters that really humanize them and really make them seem like interesting, admirable people. You could find things where it made them seem like they were so horribly monstrous for you never even to think that any normal person could be implicated in something like that, because only a monster would do this. I would never do this, so I don't have to worry about this. And so there's a balance there. But yeah, I don't know that I ever was like, oh, I really, really wish I could put this particular thing in. But I think some of that is also just because Blackhaven is, because it's literally set in a history museum. It's a lot easier. I think the sort of things, the places where that's most likely to come into contact are, in a historical game, the sort of thing where it's like, okay, like I need a person to ride a horse at this point because it would be really exciting. And then somebody
Hmm.
would say like, well, no one had any horses on that island or something like that, and
Yeah.
those, even if they're around at the time, they weren't in this particular place. Those sorts of things can kind of tug at you, but I don't think we ran into a lot of them in this game.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned Cassius, which is the next game in the series, but it is a prequel to Blackhaven. So it's supposed to come out next year, but be set before Blackhaven, which is a first-person exploration game set in colonial Virginia, confronting the legacy of the American founding fathers, and that players may return to Blackhaven Hall in. What is the relationship then between Blackhaven and Cassius beyond just being connected in terms of story? Is it appropriate to call Blackhaven a sort of like a free preview or a demo for Cassius?
Yeah, I think that's what it initially was, and then it kind of bloomed into
Hmm.
like a standalone game. So yeah, I my idea was, I had been working on Cassius first, so it's still a ways from being done. But Cassius is pitched even more mainstream. It's got puzzles, and it's got a lot of kind of gothic thriller horror elements to it. And I just thought that like that's a more pulpy genre, and I was a little concerned that with the subject material that might kind of make people think that this was not going to be a really respectful treatment. And so I thought, well,
Hmm.
maybe if I came up with a little mini game that would not only help me get through the process of going through release once and seeing what that is like, but also just let people know that I'm a serious person and that our team is going to do respectful portrayals in something that's a little bit safer, more calm story. And my additional idea for Blackhaven was maybe just that you would kind of peruse the museum, not even as a character. And then once I got Kindred and we needed the team, and once we got the team, then the game just kind of exploded. And I think it does work as a solo thing. So Cassius is, I won't reveal a whole lot about it, but it takes place inside of Blackhaven Hall when it's been evacuated during the American Revolution. And so you're exploring that and learning more about the Harwood family specifically. There's a lot of Easter eggs in Blackhaven that will be explained in Cassius. And so, yeah, I'm excited about that. I am, however, going to do another small project in between that. And that's going to be a kind of half like borderline puzzle platformer, half endless runner about Paul Revere's Ride. And it's going to be in the style of, there's a Grant Wood painting of Paul Revere's Ride. Grant Wood, who's the American Gothic painter, that looks kind of like a little model village. And so we're going to take that kind of geometric, blocky, model-esque style and do a game about Paul Revere and kind of talk about indirectly in the game how sort of the mythology around him has been used by different people for rallying points throughout history. So he really only became famous because of a Longfellow poem in the middle of the 19th century that was designed to rally people to abolition. And then Grant Wood painted a lot of scenes of American life because he was trying to create a kind of inclusive patriotism that would connect people to fight European fascism in the 30s. And, you know, even Martin Luther King at one point name-checked Paul Revere as kind of like a mythological symbol. And so, you know, he's a pretty regular guy, and his ride was relatively inconsequential, and you know, it wasn't even in his obituary. But I just kind of like the way that this keeps popping up throughout the centuries. And so they're going to have kind of a little cuter game. It's still going to have a couple of subversive elements, but it's going to be for all ages. And yeah, so we'll do that pretty quick. And then Cassius.
And so Cassius will be on Steam because you can wishlist it. And would the endless runner? How did you call it again? What did you call it?
It's kind of a mix of like a puzzle platformer and an endless runner.
Endless runner, yeah. So will that be on mobile? Because endless runner to me speaks of Temple Run and stuff like Sonic Dash. Will that be on mobile?
Yeah, it's not going to be quite as casual as some of those games, but it's going to use some of those mechanics. And yeah, it will be on mobile, especially because again, the art style is very kind of blocky and geometric, and kind of lends itself to those platforms.
Fantastic, yeah.
And, one more thing is
go.
we're also planning a VR version of that where it kind of plays out in your lap like an actual model. So yeah,
that was absolutely the next question. Absolutely, because I read that your studio's mission is to bring past stories and spaces to life by transforming archival research into richly realized digital experiences. And when I read this, I was like, well, digital experience means that you kind of anticipate video games to flourish into something else or into different ways of how we play them. So I was about to ask you about VR and AR. So this will be a VR project or an AR project where you have the actual model that you see?
Yeah, it's going to be VR. Right now, I'm experimenting with it on Quest, and hopefully, it'll be on just Steam VR, and maybe also in Quest. And it'll kind of be like a model or kind of a theater set that kind of sits at the level of your lap, and the little kind of mouse-sized Paul Revere will trot around through those, and you can kind of look over the model and sort of that it's will be similar to there's a VR game called Moss.
Yeah. When you said mouse, I knew.
So yeah, people have played that. It'll be kind of a similar setup to that. But yeah, I do think I'm very, very excited about VR in the future. I know the market share is relatively small right now. I think it's headed in the right direction. Unfortunately, it may take a little longer maybe than the boosters are planning. But I do think I'm really convinced by the technology. I find it incredibly affecting. And I think as soon as we get um, just a little bit higher resolution displays, a little bit lighter headsets, and totally wireless transmission, I think it's just going to be really, really dominant. And that might be 5 years or it might be 10 years, but I can't see how that doesn't come to fruition. And so I'm excited about the possibilities for that in the future.
Yeah, especially as we look to the newer versions of the Quest, we look to the PlayStation VR, the second one that's about to come out. So yeah, I definitely can see a trajectory for VR to develop, and hopefully also games like yours can flourish on VR. Okay, I want to ask you. So we spoke about like how this is all an independent project, how this is all on the technical side you're doing, and then that you collaborated with a bunch of other people. But you've also founded. This is also a project of Historiated Games, which is your own game design studio. So what led you to found the studio, and how are you finding the video game industry now that you are an independent developer? How did your perception of the industry change?
Yeah, I think the question of the studio, I mean, essentially right now it's just me. And then my partners. So like, my I paid the voice actors and we had collaborators on the script, but there wasn't any other technical staff, although I'm looking to possibly add some part-time people for the next game and hopefully to grow as I do things that are actually for sale, and hopefully we bring in a little bit of capital. In terms of how my perception of the game industry changed, I think I just have to acknowledge that I'm in a really unusual positive situation by being an academic. I have a day job which both provides me with a fair amount of financial stability, but also a flexible schedule. And my department and my school are very supportive of me working in this space. And so that is unfortunately something that a lot of indie developers don't have, especially in the United States, where we don't have universal health care, and it is really a risk to be a full-time indie in the US. And so that's one thing I've noticed. It's just like how fortunate I am in this particular situation. And the other thing is it just made me appreciate all of the small time developers that I appreciate who have made it, because when I look at the saturation of the market, I was looking just last night. I saw that last year on Steam, it was like 10,200 games came out, and we can guess that it's going to be some percentage higher at the end of this year. And when I was working with press contacts and just how much I had to grind to get the press coverage that we
Mhm.
got, and which has been very positive, but sent hundreds of emails and back and forth, and just so it really just it gave me a sense of the depth of the work beyond creating a game that is necessary for it to be seen by anyone. And just it just really made me appreciate the work of other indies who did enough that I got to find out about their games.
Yeah, interesting. It reminds me, I read Jason Schreier's Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, and there's an entire chapter on Stardew Valley and how, again, how to make it big from an indie developer, as for being an indie developer. And that was such a fascinating story, and I recommend it to everyone. As we head now into like the final thoughts bit of the podcast, I want to ask you, which games would you recommend to our audience? Which games do you like, or which games do you think do the things that you want to achieve with Blackhaven, and then later on with 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐬? So what kind of like games beyond Moss, beyond Going Home would you recommend?
Yeah, I think in the world of walking simulators, kind of everybody's favorites are also my favorites. I think a game with some of the best natural dialogue that I've ever played is Firewatch. Although I also
Hmm.
really like Oxenfree in that regard. In terms of environments, I think kind of the pinnacle right now is Edith Finch. I think that the environmental design is so dense in that all of the spaces feel very, very real and very lived in, and are just full of Easter eggs. And so that's kind of the my text as an environmental designer. And then just in terms of things that I've enjoyed, I always try to recommend things that are totally different than what I do. And so one game from last year that I love that did pretty well, but I want more people to play is Sayonara Wild Hearts.
I played it. I loved it.
It's just such a joyful experience. I mean, really, just really floored me. And then like on the mainstream side, I also thought that the Bowser's Fury add-on to the Super Mario 3D World Switch port was just awesome and really fun, and a great example of kind of like continuing to remove barriers from like a 3D platformer. And so yeah, I thought those were extremely cool. And then it's getting really good reviews, but unfortunately I haven't got a chance to play it, but I really want to play the Forgotten City, which is
Yes, me
the
too. Yeah.
Skyrim mod that has grown into a independent game about, I don't think it's actually set in Pompeii, but has kind of a Pompeii-like scenario, and a Groundhog Day time loop and all of that, set in the Roman Empire. And so I'm excited to play that. Hopefully I'll get to that maybe even this week.
Yeah, thank you. With Forgotten City, it's so funny to me. Like, time loops seem to be the 2021 trend in video games. With Returnal, Deathloop, Forgotten City, Lemnis Gate, all of these games, which seem to have like really adopted this concept.
Yeah, all the way back to Minute.
To Minute, you're right. Yeah. And then he also 30-second hero RPG. That was the RPG where you only had 30 seconds. So yeah, this time manipulation has been going around this year. James, if you had one piece of advice for people wanting to get into game design, what would that be? What would your advice be?
I mean, this is well-tried advice, but it's try to make a game. I think that there are people who are obsessed with going to the right school, building a team, any of these sorts of things. And I, again, had kind of a fortunate situation because I had a lot of experience in this core element of a game team before I started experimenting with games with 3D modeling. But just nothing beats just try to actually build a game on any scale, and of course start small. But that would be the biggest thing. And the other would be just to try to, I mean, you're constantly seeking external validation to make sure that you're not deluding yourself about what you're doing. So have people play your game, show other people who make games what you're doing, ask them for tough criticism. But I think paired with that is also just to try to strip away your fear of different things. I had, for all the way into my 30s, an aversion to serious coding because I hadn't been great at math in high school, and I thought that I thought I had an art brain rather than a code brain. And but I was able to learn enough to get something that was playable. And I think that especially in the age of YouTube and Stack Overflow, and there's so many resources that are just abounding, message boards and Reddit and everything, for anybody who's interested in something, just push yourself to experiment with new techniques and things that you may think aren't quote unquote what you do, because you might surprise yourself. And even if you're not amazing, you may be good enough to do the task at hand.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic advice. Even for someone like me, I did literature all the way through higher education, and now I'm doing new media stuff, and I'm just like, oh wow, like yourself, I thought I had an art brain, but I'm like, oh wow, I can do media stuff now, and it's fascinating what we can do today, even without knowing math. Because like yourself, I'm also bad with math and stuff like that. Thank you so much again. For podcast listeners and viewers, around Edinburgh, a new academic year is about to start here in Scotland, and so we are again ramping up our activity. So in this sense, please stay tuned for more announcements from the History and Games Lab, and also for our newly founded society, History and Games Society, which you may find on social media everywhere at HNGSOC. Again, if you happen to be in Edinburgh, we will be starting to run events probably from next week. It is Freshers Week right now at the time of recording. So tomorrow, on the 16th of September, the society has its first social, which is very exciting for us. And then next week, or in 2 weeks' time, we will probably finalize the guest lectures for the new academic semester. And then somewhere in October, we will also let you know about what the guest lectures will be in the second semester. So that is very exciting stuff as we head towards the new academic year. As always, if you have any feedback or would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance, our DMs are open on Twitter at @HNGLab, or you can email us at hngLabpodcast@gmail.com. For more on the History and Games Lab, please access our Linktree link, which you will have on the screen if you're watching the podcast, and you'll find in the description if you are listening to the podcast. On the Linktree link, you will find all of our outputs plus our social media. James, where could our listeners find more about you? Where are you on the internet?
Yeah, my Twitter is @James Coltrain, but I would especially encourage people to follow the studio page, which is @𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐻�historiatedGame, one word. You can also go to our website, historiated.com, and we'll continue to have updates both about Cassius and about Paul Revere in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, thank you so much. James, if there was one thing that you wanted to emphasize, one thing out of everything we just talked about that you would like listeners and viewers to take away from this podcast, what is that one thing? What would that one thing be?
For me, it's just that I really, really, again, appreciate the collaboration that I had with Xavier University of Louisiana. So I want to give a shout out to Sharon Roberts, Charlene Senegal-Decour, T.L. Alphonse, Tyra Johnson, Naomi Winston, who all helped on our team, and our lead actress, Darby Farr. And then some of your listeners may know that the Louisiana area had a fairly severe hurricane relatively recently. And there is a plantation museum that does not have the problems that Blackhaven does, called the Whitney Plantation, which had a number of damages to their exhibit. And this is a very unique museum that has been, it's a colonial plantation that is presented primarily with the intent of teaching people about slavery rather than about the ruling family. And so if you Google that, you can find links to donate if you'd like to help them get back on the ground so they can continue educating people. It's really, really important historic site. So I just want to give them a plug. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming. And as always, I will add the links to everything that we've discussed, including the Whitney Plantation, in the description, in the YouTube video, in the description on anywhere you might be listening to this. So please do check out the Whitney Plantation. And if you're able to, please do consider donating. Thank you so much, James, for joining me. And until next time, everyone. Bye-bye. The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab, which should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.